My name is Ernie Suggs. I'm a reporter and editor for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm also the co-editor of Unapologetically ATL, which is the AJC's weekly newsletter, which brings you a glimpse into Black culture here in Atlanta and across the country. Thank you very much, first of all, for joining us today, and thank you for being subscribers to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Your support makes everything that we do possible. And in addition to the great journalism that we do every day and on AJC.com and in the newspaper, we like to offer live events, and we do these live events at Unapologetically ATL every month. And these events bring you closer to what we do, and also gives a voice to the community about what they're doing. And today's conversation is going to be amazing. We've always heard the phrase Atlanta and Black Mecca. So today we're going to talk about whether or not Atlanta is still a Black Mecca. And my co-curator, my co-editor, my reporter who helps run Unapologetically ATL, Nedra, Rhone, a columnist here at the paper, is going to lead us through that conversation. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce my co-curator, as we like to say, Nedra Rhone. Welcome, Nedra.
Thanks, Ernie. Hello, everyone. I'm Nedra Rhone, lifestyle columnist for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and I also co-edit the Unapologetically ATL newsletter. Before we get started today, I do want to say a few things. We have about 45 minutes for a briefing today. We'll take your questions later in the session, and you can use the Q&A function on the right sidebar. It's a question mark inside of a circle where you can add your questions, and you can even vote for other people's questions. That'll move the question up to the top so that we'll be able to recognize those as priority, and we'll try to get to them in the end. Today, we have two guests that I'm very excited to speak with. We have Todd Michney, who is associate professor in the School of History and Sociology at Georgia Tech. He is also the author of Surrogate Suburbs, Black Upward Mobility and Neighborhood Change in Cleveland, 1900 to 1980. Hi, Todd. How are you?
Hi, Nedra. Thanks for having me today.
And we also have as a guest Maurice Hobson, who is Associate Professor of African American Studies at Georgia State University and the author of The Legend of the Black Mecca, Politics and Class in the Making of Modern Atlanta. Welcome, Maurice.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here with you all.
Well, I'm so excited to talk to both of you. We have talked before, and I want to start off our conversation just talking a little bit about something that a lot of people were asking. This was a question that I had too when I started looking into this issue, and it's the whole concept of what exactly is the middle class. I think it's a difficult thing to define. When I looked it up, I could find income levels, and it basically said if you live in Atlanta and you make anywhere between $48,000 and $141,000, you are middle class. And I thought to myself, that's interesting, because I know that there's a difference between middle class and Black middle class. And I know that there's a difference between Black middle class in New York City, for example, and Black middle class in Atlanta. So my first question to you all is, what does it mean to be part of the Black middle class in Atlanta? And Maurice, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you for that question. The first thing that I would add, if we want to talk about Atlanta and class formation and stratification, particularly in the Black community, it goes back to 1847 and even 1865. Historically, Atlanta's notoriety in terms of class formation and stratification is based on three things historically. That's Black education. In the context of Atlanta is the historically Black colleges and universities. There's 6 within the city. That bleeds over into Black economics, which we discussed in terms of the Sweet Auburn district, which was deemed as the richest Negro street in the world. And then we move into Black political empowerment and electoral politics. And we can see that kind of come into fruition, as early as the 1860s, but we really see it take off in the 1940s and then later in the 1970s, primarily with the election of Maynard Holbrook Jackson Jr. as Atlanta's first Black mayor. So this notion of class formation and stratification is based on those things and how Black Atlantans engage that kind of thing. But there's a larger kind of conversation here too. And I don't want to get into, a lot of Marxist analysis, but when you talk about Marxism, you get into class formation, okay? And in the terms of Marxism, you're dealing with this notion of the elite, the bourgeois, the petty bourgeois, the proletariat, and the lumpen proletariat. So you're dealing with like a monarchy or generational wealth. And then you're dealing with the merchant class, which is the bourgeois. Then you're dealing with petty bourgeois, who is a middle class. They go to work, but they receive wages and different things. Then you deal with the working class, and then you deal with the lumpen proletariat, which is the informal economies. The interesting thing with class formation and stratification in a city like Atlanta is that the Black elite oftentimes had access to generational wealth, which would oftentimes connect them to the old white planter class, whereas the Black middle class was more or less a part of the merchant class or a class that received education and worked. And so the thing about this is that when we talk about class formation and stratification within the Black community, within Black Atlanta, we're talking about behavior. We're talking about some different things. So I'll leave it at that for right now, and we'll let Todd take over.
Thanks, Maurice, and thanks for that question. We live in a country where everybody wants to identify as middle class generally, especially with the decline of working class politics and decline of unions. Many people, most everybody, claims this label. And I think it's important to think historically how what the middle class looks like has changed over time, and specifically for African Americans. And before 1964, before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you saw very different looking class structure. And some of the occupations that didn't carry a lot of prestige in society as a whole had disproportionate prestige in the Black community because they paid better. There was a time when up to 40% of Black men were relegated to low-wage labor. And so if someone was, chauffeur, that was a job that was better paid. It came with responsibilities and proximity to wealthy and powerful white employers. And you could accumulate, I even found in my research examples of people inheriting small sums of money. But it's a service position and a servile position in a sense. So, once Black people were able to enter the white collar world in greater numbers outside of just the work that was provided by Black communities and Black enterprise, it started to resemble more the class structure of the society as a whole. And there's different ways. You can't just define this in terms of occupation, because that changes over time. In terms of income, as Nedra was saying, that might have different buying power in different parts of the country. And then, culture and respectability has often been a marker that people use to define middle class, regardless of what their employment might be. And finally, I would say home ownership. That's been something that all Americans have aspired increasingly to since the turn of the 20th century, and has become a marker of middle class status and a source of generational wealth. And we see a drastic racial homeownership gap that translates into a large racial wealth gap. So I think that's an important part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, definitely. I actually want to talk about that a little bit. I'm glad you brought it up, because we first met actually based on your research on redlining, which to me was fascinating because it really offered some perspective that I didn't have on that topic before. And I'd love for you to share with the audience, first of all, just, what redlining is for people who may not understand. And then also, how has it impacted Black mobility in Atlanta and nationwide?
Sure. Well, redlining is, it depends on whether we want to say specifically or as a kind of broad basket of forms of urban disinvestment. Sometimes people talk about other things like gentrification, highway construction, that are related to redlining. But strictly speaking, redlining is financial institutions or other kinds of finance-related businesses like insurance, deciding where they are or not going to provide service. So they're judging certain areas to be more or less worthy of investment on the premise that that investment is going to, not pan out or be less profitable. And it was, there's a lot of factors that would go into these assessments, but race is kind of the glaring one, and the one that is most troubling in terms of how this mentality came about. And there's always, been a prejudice among white Americans historically toward Black people. But when we started to see this as an actual federal policy in the 1930s, we had the Great Depression, and there was a government agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation that made these maps where they surveyed every major city in the country, and in fact, every city over 40,000 people. And they described the neighborhoods in terms of whether they would be good investments. And this was a time when mortgages were going to a longer interval toward the 30-year mortgage that we know today. But prior to this, mortgages were only 2, 3, or 5 years that had to be renewed. And ironically, Black people had more financial options before this. There were first of all, there are many Black-owned institutions, things like Citizens Trust Bank, which exists today. It still is the fourth largest Black bank in the country. That was founded by Heman Perry, who built Washington Park. The Atlanta Life Insurance Company issued mortgages to its policyholders. And there were actually white banks that specialized in lending to Black people. That doesn't mean that they did so on fair terms, because they'd always have a markup. But actually, once the government starts sending these signals that you shouldn't be lending for 30 years to certain neighborhoods and certain kinds of people, and encouraging banks to think that way, every single bank would have a map of where they would or wouldn't lend. It got so bad that even some Black banks had these kinds of maps and started to think along these lines. So when you racialize the entire lending environment, send this kind of signal, it kind of means that you're penalized if you don't think in this way. You become less profitable if you don't conform to the racialized way of thinking. So this really got severely out of hand by the 1950s and 60s. And we finally passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that made this technically legal, although it's continued into our present day and continues as people find ways to get around the act. And in 1977, we had a Community Reinvestment Act that started to try and reverse the flow of investment and incentivize banks to start lending in areas that have been neglected. But it still has done not that much to really fully address the situation, and that's where we find ourselves today.
Okay. Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I feel like when we talk about Black mobility, people were very often moving because they wanted to obtain these things. They wanted a home. They wanted to be in a place where they would get a fair income. They wanted to build careers. That's what I wanted when I moved to Atlanta. But, these things happen, right? So when I looked at the numbers, I was very surprised, because I feel like there's been a narrative about a reverse migration happening, and that there's this massive influx of people moving from the northern parts to the south. But when you look at the actual numbers, you see that, in fact, the population in the south has hovered at or around 55% since 1970. And that was interesting to me, because that kind of debunks this whole idea that everyone is moving back south now. That's not happening. But what is happening, and what I want to talk about, is the migration of Black people to Atlanta. And I think we saw in 1990 to about 2010, that being the real boom period where everybody was coming here. What do you think was attracting people, first of all, and then what's happening now? Because I think that we're starting to see a bit of a shift to other cities, or other states, I should say, being Texas, which I was like, what? Sorry for anyone who's from Texas, but I was like, what? Why is everyone going to Texas? So Maurice, can you share just a little bit about what was going on in that boom period that was drawing people to Atlanta?
Well, I'll tell you what, my wife is a native Texan, and it's good living in Texas, in Dallas and Houston. I mean, it is some good stuff going on. There's some other things going on with it. But to answer your question, Atlanta's, this notion of the Black Mecca is, I wrote this book titled The Legend of the Black Mecca. And the thing about it is, the reason I named it The Legend of the Black Mecca is, for every truth, for every legend, there is truth to it. But sometimes we have to figure out what is real and what is embellished. And so there's truth to what Atlanta is. And I explained to you all before, Black education, Black economics, Black political and power electoral politics. And between 1990 and 2010, we see an extreme production of Black expressive culture. But there's a political conversation that takes place with this as well. And that political conversation really starts in the state of Alabama. And this is historical. It is a theoretical framework that I proposed in my research called the Black New South. And what the Black New South is hinged on is the experiences of Black people in the United States, whether it be nationally or internationally, after 1965. And the question is asked, why 1965? Well, if you look at the state of Alabama and you see what happens in Birmingham, Birmingham and St. Petersburg, Florida, and you see the creation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which buttresses the 14th Amendment and grants equal protection and due process under the law, you begin to see where Black people across the American South in the 1960s now are supposed to have the federal government's protection. So that should mitigate aspects of lynching, police brutality, and all kinds of different things. The other aspect of it is what happens in Selma, Alabama, my actual hometown. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 that comes out of Selma, which buttresses the 15th Amendment and gives universal suffrage. And so coming out of Alabama, you have legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, which politically changes the American South based on citizenship and voting. What happens with this is this creates a particular moment from 1965 until about 1980, when Ronald Reagan is elected, to where Black people enjoy the opportunity to vote in their best interest. One of the things about Atlanta that became unique is we also have to talk about the Sun Belt boom. So there's a Sun Belt boom, a boom of technology, and we see the American economy move from the industrial age, from the Rust Belt that Todd so beautifully puts in his book of Looking at Cleveland, and understanding, the Midwest and, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, and all of that. But then you have the rise of the information age. And this information age goes from Virginia all the way across to California's south. The climate is better, the tax breaks are better. And so we see corporations in the information age that are able to really put headquarters in places like the Carolinas and Georgia and Alabama, Texas, and all kinds of different things. Well, what this does is it reverses the Great Migration, where African Americans were leaving the American South and going to the Midwest, Northeast, or West Coast for jobs, because the creation of the Black New South legislation allows for the American South to become the next frontier for prosperity or promise in terms of getting into industry. And what happens with that is Black folk who had left the American South begin to move back to the South, but not necessarily to the rural areas, to the urban spaces. And so we see growth across the South, in Dallas and Houston, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Little Rock, Birmingham, Jackson, Memphis, North Carolina. But for the sake of today, we're going to talk about Atlanta. When Maynard Jackson decides that he's going to run for office, Maynard Jackson understood that there was a changing demographic because of the Atlanta University centers. That they were already attracting young Black smart folk. But what also is going on here is that Maynard Jackson is able to understand that there's a white progressive coalition, and if he could marry Atlantans, Black folk returning to the American South and migrating to the city, and this white coalition, that he could possibly win. And when he does so, when he becomes mayor of Atlanta, he runs several offices, Senate, loses, becomes vice mayor, and becomes mayor. Maynard Jackson then weaponizes affirmative action, gives access to economic opportunity through city contracts, and eventually his 35% of city contracts becomes the gold standard for inclusion in the nation. And that is what attracts not only Black people from Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Boston, it also attracts Black folk from Nigeria, from Ghana, from the Caribbean. And so you see this influx on Atlanta because Maynard Jackson is able to use his power and prowess as the city's top city official to really open things up financially, and it gave an opportunity for folks to come to Atlanta.
Okay. I want to actually, as you were talking, I recalled one of the questions that someone submitted, and it relates to exactly what you're talking about, so I'm going to throw it in here right now. And he asked, what role has the Black Democratic leadership of Atlanta and Georgia played in the decline of the Black middle class since the 1970s? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll say this in short. It would be irresponsible for me to lump all Black politically elected officials in one category. I do think that Maynard Jackson, as mayor, was a unique political figure for Atlanta, and really trying to help, the least of these, and really trying to make open some things. I think Andrew Young as congressman in the 1970s, and then as UN ambassador under President Jimmy Carter, who was of Georgia. I think that when Andrew Young comes back and becomes Atlanta's second Black mayor, one of the things that Andrew Young notices is that Ronald Reagan's administration is removing federal funds from cities. And so as a result of that, what happens is Andrew Young uses his prowess in the United Nations to be able to get the African world to invest in Atlanta, which also brings the European world. And so one of the critiques that people would also often put on Ambassador Andrew Young as mayor is that he was globetrotting, but what he was doing is he was really weaponizing his allies to invest in a city that where money had been taken from. But then you ask the question, you know, since then we've had Black Democratic leaders, we've had Black Democratic mayors, and we've seen some issues that may be problematic. I mean, the Olympification of Atlanta, the building of the 1,000-bed jail as a result of the first thing that was built on time and under budget after Atlanta wins the bid for the Olympic Games, the creation of the Red Dog Police, the militarization of the police, the low income, no income housing that has been moved out of the city, the displacement. So it's an interesting thing, you know, where politics kind of play out, but the idea is that it is the people have to push back and vote to push the agenda of what the people want, the consensus of what the people want.
Yeah. One of the other things that comes to mind when we talk about this is I came across another statistic, and it was basically saying that in the 1980s, that was when we saw the smallest, I won't say wealth gap, but it was home ownership gap between Black Atlantans and the rest of Atlanta. And then from there, it just kind of went. Woo. So how is it that, you know, in 1980, in some sense, the Black middle class in Atlanta was doing better than they are now?
Well, I'll say this, and then, you know, let Todd. This is the interesting thing. Ronald Reagan ran on the platform to flatten all civil rights gains made by all Americans in the 1960s. So he really worked to flatten the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which then would make America great again and make it be what it was in the 1950s. That was the whole notion of when he decides to run for president in Neshoba County, is to kind of use this dogma and weaponize that. And so the thing is now we're almost 40 plus years behind, and we see something that has been put in play for 40 years. And so we're starting to see the manifestation of fruition of the seeds that have been planted that impede progress.
I would just add that when we look at Atlanta compared to the city that I've studied or cities like Cleveland, you know, in 1982, the industrial Midwest and North is really reaching a low point. But from 1982 to 1987, Atlanta is leading the country in terms of job growth every year for those 5 years. And so we wouldn't be surprised to see gains for the city's Black population, just kind of in line with what's happening in general in the local economy. And, you know, as Maurice puts it in his book here so eloquently, there's a lot of other kinds of particular entrepreneurship taking form in the recording industry and entertainment industry that, you know, add to this feeling of prosperity. Interestingly enough, you know, one of the most the earliest, most famous declarations of this Black Mecca was in 1971 in Ebony in an article by Phil Garland. But people sometimes gloss over her subtitle, which was "Racial Peace and Prosperity Are Mixed with Problems in This Bustling Downtown." So if we look closely, there's always been a kind of ambivalence or a recognition that it may not be all it is cracked up to be, or maybe we need to work harder to bring this into reality. So it's kind of an aspirational concept that people have used to promote the city and create opportunities, but it's not something that we can just be comfortable with or just take for granted.
Right.
And it's going to follow in line with the different economic shifts and demographic shifts around the country.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little because I do feel that there's this disconnect between, you know, what people think they're coming to and what they find when they get here. And then there's this reckoning of like, oh, wait a minute, this wasn't what I thought it was going to be. And I think you both talked about this in different ways. You know, Todd, you alluded to people coming and the Black middle class kind of shifting to the suburbs. Can you talk a little bit about that movement from the city's core out into the suburbs and how that impacted the middle class?
Sure. I mean, when you look at U.S. cities more generally, and southern cities have come to resemble northern ones from the 20th century on. So you could really say generally, cities' Black populations were ghettoized, especially in the north, into these certain areas. But these pockets of settlement started developing more toward the edges of the city, toward the periphery. That was particularly important in northern cities. Had always been kind of the case in a city like Atlanta. You saw clusters of freed people forming settlements all over the city and all around the city after the Civil War. But these areas were more open. The housing there was newer. Some of them were kind of secondhand housing. So as upwardly mobile African Americans would move to certain areas like, say, Peyton Forest, Cascade Heights, the white people who lived there would often, move away, white flight. So, but still, those places represented a place with newer housing, more space, better shopping facilities. And so that was kind of the pattern of mobility within the city. And then that started extending out to certain suburbs. And we've seen that progress to this day as Atlanta's metro Black population has moved out into the surrounding counties. But that can sometimes come with some additional difficulties because people become more isolated. They might have to commute further for jobs that are moving generally to the northern part of the metro, which is still predominantly white. There's less resources in a suburb to handle questions like alleviating poverty or subsidizing affordable housing. As much as we need to work harder on that in Atlanta itself, suburbs have even less resources to devote. If you think about hospital access and where the best medical facilities are, there's a kind of double-edged sword there, and so people might find themselves isolated in the suburbs and dispersed. The kind of flip side to segregation has always been congregation and people being able to come together. And once you're kind of just diffused out into the far suburbs, you can find yourself very isolated. And indeed, we've seen rising poverty levels. We've seen resegregation of school districts in these sometimes now predominantly Black suburbs. And so it's not always all it's cracked up to be. And meanwhile, we see affluent white people moving back into the city and gentrifying, which is kind of reversing the historic trend. So it's another thing we need to contend with when we think about these population dynamics.
So I was waiting for one of you to say the G word. I wasn't going to say it, but I'm glad Todd did. So now I can ask another question from someone who used that word. And this question is, how has gentrification within the city of Atlanta hurt or helped the Black middle class? I'll let either of you take that one.
You want to go first, Todd?
I can go first. The first thing I'd note is this links back to the discussion on redlining earlier. And these areas that were supposedly written off having a death sentence have now become quite profitable, places to invest and buy, and home prices have risen. So it's really all about where you put the investment. It's not about any inevitable kind of destiny for any given place. But I think gentrification, people, when they survey residents, they're always ambivalent because with gentrification, there comes more city services, more shopping facilities. The problem is if you can't afford to take advantage of those, if you can't afford the property taxes and remain in your home, you aren't in a position to benefit. So you're more often displaced and put in a situation where you have to find comparable housing now in a housing market where prices are going up across the board. So, it's difficult to say. I think you would find people feeling ambivalent about gentrification, but there's an increasing concern that this is going to continue to displace historic African American communities further out to the periphery and possibly lead to more isolated. I'd throw it to Maurice from there.
Yeah. Well. Can you all hear me? Okay. Am I on?
Yes.
Okay. So to add what Todd is saying, and I want to talk Atlanta specific right here. Okay. On September 18th, 1990, Atlanta won the bid to host the Olympic Games. This is the thing about this. The seeds that were planted in 1975 when a handball player goes to then Maynard Jackson as mayor and says, I believe Atlanta can host the Olympic Games. What happens is Maynard Jackson is able to convene 16 of the most prominent business entities in Atlanta. They vote a resounding no because of terrorism and debt from other Olympics. But in 1987, when Billy Payne approaches Andrew Young, they see a way of doing this. But this is the thing, and I have to put this in there in this particular context. The famous Black scholar, historian and sociologist, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, wrote a book here in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1903 called The Souls of Black Folks. He wrote it in Gaines and Fountain Hall on campus at the Atlanta University Center. And in this, he lays out this concept called double consciousness. And basically, it talks about how Black America have this burden of looking at themselves through the eyes of others. And the issue is that we should hope all human beings are able to see themselves in their own terms. The reason I'm saying this to you is for Black folk, the Olympics meant one particular set of things that was negative. And for white Atlanta, it meant something else that was positive. And the thing about it is what we see with the Olympic Games is we see what I present is called the Olympification of Atlanta. It's a series of theoretical events that take place on the ground. Urban renewal, gentrification, political economy, regime theory, and then the concept of Black folks' racial uplift theory. And I don't have time to break all that stuff down, but this is where I'm going with this. In 1987, when Atlanta was approached about hosting the Olympic Games, the business elite in the city, who are overwhelmingly white, draw an invisible circle around the city and name it the Olympic Ring. The goal of the Olympics becomes an opportunity to take back downtown Atlanta, to chart the course and what would take place in the center of Atlanta, the main area of Atlanta. We have 38 years, with 36 years into a 40-year plan to see what Atlanta will be. And what we have seen is the demolition of low income, no income housing, and the Olympification, or the putting out, the displacement, demonization, criminalization, and the disenfranchising of Black folk who have been moved to parts of Clayton County and parts of DeKalb County. And that's where we see all of this take place. And so when we talk about gentrification, we can start with looking at the model cities initiatives that put 75, 85 through the Sweet Auburn district and displaced 10,000 people and multiple thousands of businesses. We can talk about the displacement of churches, of homes, other business, barbershops, all kinds of ways of building community. And now all of that has moved to the suburbs. And I find it interesting that it's suburban Black Atlanta that delivered democracy in 2020 and in 2021. It's those people who they deem as unwanted people who went to the polls and voted to really promote this notion of American democracy. Black people have saved democracy, and it's Black people, particularly in the state of Georgia, in suburban Black Atlanta communities.
Got it. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the people who are migrating to Atlanta or to Georgia, because I think we can focus on the city and what the city is doing and has done, but I think we also have to consider who's coming. And I think there's been some indication that over the years, and perhaps maybe it's 2010 on, that it's been a younger population. Maybe it's been a less educated or less wealthy migrant coming to the city. And I'm wondering if you can expound at all just on how the person that is coming into the city of Atlanta is impacting the middle class of Atlanta.
Well, I think Todd had something he wanted to add to that, and Todd can go with this. So,
I don't know if I have anything specific to speak to your question, Nedra, but I'll think about it. I was going to just kind of pick up on what Maurice is saying about the Olympics and note that two additional developments: the Beltline,
yes,
and also the Great Recession and foreclosure crisis just compounded and kind of supercharged gentrification. Which had already started in earnest, had been set off by the Olympics. And there's a new book out by Dan Immergluck where he talks about, could we have taken a different kind of approach here and banked this land, set aside land for affordable housing development, require developers to do that instead of just spinning off parks and amenities as quickly as possible, which raised land values and shut people out. So I guess I would imagine, someone coming to Atlanta now is facing a very different prospect of finding a place to live, whereas they could have previously, found any number of historic Black neighborhoods in the core area. Now they're maybe going directly to a suburb. And so, we're now in, like Maurice just said, we're in a stage of, 40 years or more of this process. And there's this disjuncture where the white city business leadership and promoters of the city have just said, we've made all the right decisions. This is the best possible outcome. If you're seeing that from the other side of the looking glass, it's quite a different situation.
And to add to that and to go into Nedra's conversation is this. You're right, Todd. So That invisible circle, the Olympic ring that was drawn by the white business elite, that is the Beltline. So, I mean, like, you know, we get out here and, you know, we're walking and we say, oh, this is great in art, but we got to think about all the people who were displaced. But to go back to the question that Nedra just asked about who's coming to Atlanta. And this is one of the interesting things about this. I love this city, but I am not from Atlanta. And every time I go out to do a presentation, I often say that because y'all, if you're familiar with Atlanta, particularly Black communities in Atlanta, you got hashtag old Atlanta, and then you got hashtag ATL. And old Atlanta will straight up tell you, I am not from ATL, I'm from Atlanta. And usually they'll be like, I'm from Atlanta, shawty, and pop the guy. You know, the thing about that is this. There's a new group of like particularly Black folk who are coming into the city, and many of them have no understanding of what Atlanta was 50, 40, 30 years ago. And, you know, I can't help but think about this. If you see in my background over my shoulder, you see the Outkast album, ATLians. And the reason that album is named that is because Atlantans, Black Atlantans in the mid 1990s, right around the Olympics, were seen as being aliens because there had been this deluge of interlopers that had come into the city who were Black. And so the thing about it is there are many who, Black, white, and indifferent, who have come to Atlanta and don't know how Atlanta was set up before and don't take it into consideration. Whereas when I wrote The Legend of the Black Mecca, one of the things I had to go to and do is I had to go to old Atlanta and show myself approved. I mean, the interviews I did with dope dealers from the 1980s, the Miami boys and the Atlanta hustlers. I mean, I had to demonstrate to them, like, I'm not a cop, but I'm here to get this story right. And when I did that for Atlanta, when I went to old Atlanta in the right kind of way, they saw me as something, and then they absorbed me and said, okay, he understands what's going on and he's trying to really articulate the story. So we have to note and understand that difference between what was here, what's here now, and how do we move forward with that?
So I hear you saying that there are, you know, people who come with this idea that they are going to take something from the city without maybe thinking about what they should bring with them to the city. Is that?
Well, and Goody Mob so poetically puts it in the song Dirty South. And when they rocked up, rock the bells, talking about New York, he's talking about Black New Yorkers. When they rocked up, rock the bells, we took what we wanted and left them quiet as hell. What y'all really know about the Dirty South? What he's saying is like we're here. This is ours. So you're not going to come down here and think we're dumb and slow on the uptake. Like, we're here too. And that's a part of the reason why in 1990, when Atlanta wins the bid for the Olympic Games, Atlanta was the most violent city in the United States because there was a showdown taking place between the Miami boys who would come to bring crack cocaine and all kind of different things and the Atlanta hustlers. I mean, it was a straight up, you know, turf war going on in the city at the time. And, you know, I guess I'm weaponizing it like that because it helps us to understand those longstanding tensions and trends that are implicit in the city.
All right. So we're coming up on close to time. I want to make sure that I get a few questions in from our audience. This one says, there are periodically calls to leverage Black buying power as a way to address the Black-white wealth gap and Black poverty. How useful is Black buying power as a tool for Black progress?
I'll take it really quickly. One of the faults in this Black buying power, I mean, you listen to the radio when I'm driving into the city. I live in one of those Black enclave suburbs. And when you're driving into the city, you hear, you know, on Tuesday, we're not going to buy from this place. We're not going to buy from that place. Well, you can't do that one time a week, 4 times a month. Because corporations make decisions about finances based on quarters. So the one Tuesday, the 4 Tuesdays, you know, every so often, that doesn't do much. You really have to boycott. And when you boycott, you give up inconveniences. I mean, if we think about the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, we're talking 381 days of Black folks not using the bus. And when the white business elite, the civic leaders in Montgomery realized they had lost a lot of money in their investment, that's when they changed the policies to really push desegregation. So if this buying power, this conversation around Black buying power, we can't do days, we have to do whole quarters. and to make these corporations know and understand the reason that you're in the red this go around is because, and not in the black, is because black folk decided to not deal with you in any kind of way. And it's difficult to do. There are multiple black Atlantas, and we can't assume that all of them are the same.
Mm-hmm.
I think historically there's been amazing achievements through black purchasing power, like the Montgomery bus boycott. And it's certainly a force to be reckoned with. But there's a provocative argument in this book by Maurice that argues that, there's still a racial wealth gap. There's a structural inequality where black people just don't have the same access to job opportunity, capital, even, black doctors and lawyers clientele tends to be less affluent. So really we need to fix the overall wealth gap that is important historically as black purchasing power and buying black and pooling that money is. It's not going to solve everything unless the reason why that was so effective is because black Americans were forced into a segregated situation where they had to pull together and they had limited places where they could put their money. Now that it's open after 1964, I don't think it's going to be able to solve everything. Really what we need to do is solve the racial wealth gap and structural inequality so that black purchasing power can do even more for the community is the way I look at it.
Okay. I want to try to get in another question here, which says, what can be done to address the fair housing of Atlanta's African-American population in comparison to Atlanta's white population? Any thoughts on that?
Hey, Todd made mention of it. My colleague, our colleague, Dan Emmergluck, just wrote a great book called Red Hot City. It gives us a lot to consider. I urge you to go out and check out that book. It is a very thoughtful piece that really engages policy and practice. And so Dan is someone whose book really articulates those conversations.
Okay.
I'm assigning it to my current students right now, and I mean the window is closing. We're completing this belt line, and if we don't think more deliberately about affordable housing, people are going to get shut out. In historic African American neighborhoods, there's going to be, not that many black people left if we don't think about this more deliberately. And so I think it's a real call to address the situation if we want to have the inclusive Atlanta for everybody that we could have the potential to make here.
And Nedra, I'll add this. This is one of the conversations that we had earlier. If we're going to really consider Atlanta to still be the Black Mecca, we have to expand that notion of Black Mecca, meaning it may not mean that the mayor is black per se, but it means that there is a mayor that is sensitive to the needs of marginalized multiple marginalized communities. And that, we don't have to look at the symbolism of race, the race of the top city holder versus someone who believes in equity and fairness and in all kinds of different ways.
Okay. Yeah. So I do want to ask my final question of the two of you. Should there be a Black Mecca? Should we saddle any one city with that very weighty label? That's a lot. It's a lot to deliver.
I don't think so. I think that it has been unfair that Atlanta has tried to market itself and take that on because it doesn't allow for Atlanta to be a city full of human beings. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that Atlanta has done great things to be inclusive, but it technically is the bare minimum of what's supposed to be done. And I guess what I'm saying is that city contracts should mirror the citizens of a city. And I mean, 35% is good, but I mean, in the 1970s, 1980s, Atlanta was 67% Black. So, if we're talking about fair and equity, like if we're talking about representations of the people, then we have to look at something differently. And so with that being said, I think it's unfair to put that pressure on Atlanta.
I don't really have anything to add. I mean, there are other cities that have claimed this label historically, whether it's Washington, D.C., whether it's Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance, Chicago, now Dallas and Houston, right? And doing historical work on Dallas, I'm seeing that there is a kind of effort to, along similar lines as Atlanta, just didn't get the prominence that Atlanta did until recently. So, yeah, I don't know if that's something cities should be aspiring to, although I think as a way to express the pride in the city's African American heritage. I think again, if it's thought of as a work in progress, and something that acknowledges how far we need to go, what we need to do to make it better, then it can be productive.
All right, great. Well, we are just about out of time. I think we're a little over time, actually. So I want to thank everyone for attending today. And I want to remind you all to subscribe to Unapologetically ATL, which is our free weekly newsletter at ajc.com. And please make sure that you support our guests today, Todd Michney and Maurice Hobson. They both have wonderful books that will provide a lot more information on all of these things that we talked about today. So thank you guys very much for joining us.
Thank you.
For having me.
Signing off.